All right,
Mike,
so,
could you mute all the rest of us?
no, but
No?
Good
I guess
idea, knowing that
in
crowd.
order for me to do
So-
that, I have to go in someplace and do it, and I don't want to do that, so I might.
Okay.
Let's do it ourselves.
Yeah, just mute. You want us to mute ourselves?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay.
Some of you had trouble doing that in the past.
All right, so we're going to start the meeting today. And our speaker today is none other than the very exciting, very vibrant, very witty, very urbane Bob Clarke, a retiree from the Social Science Department. He is known for his world travels. There's not a single person who ever worked for the City Colleges of Chicago at any campus that has traveled to as many places in the world as Bob has. So that's one great distinction. He's been to every dusty corner of the world known to man, and he's only been mugged 11 times. He's also the president of the committee to
Chicago Committee to Defend the Bill of Rights.
Chicago Committee to defend the Bill of Rights, and he was also the president of Chicago Architecture Preservation
No, I was on the board for 6 years.
Group for 6 years.
Preservation
And-
Chicago.
Preservation Chicago. He is a mighty member of Alliance Francaise, where he goes for classes to learn about these French novels that we're talking about today. And so today we begin with six recent French novels by Bob Clarke. So go ahead, Bob.
Okay, just a quick correction there on the Alliance Francaise. I was a faithful student there until the beginning of COVID, when they took that pretext to dump my favorite professor, who's been my mentor there for years. So I have not been back there since they did that. However, I have arranged, or did help arrange, to continue classes with him privately with some of our more devoted students. So I've sort of severed my connection with the Alliance Francaise because they unceremoniously dumped my favorite professor. And but I have continued with him to do some studies. I wanted to organize this today in 6 different segments, one for each novel. I'll try to keep each one to about 8 or 9 minutes. And if during the presentation of a particular one you want to pop in with a quick comment or question, I don't mind that, but I thought we might do a little question and answer after each one. This has the further advantage, this arrangement, that as terminal boredom sits in for any individual one of you, you can just drop out after that particular novel, but you'll miss the succeeding ones. So let me just launch into this. The French literary scene is still very much alive. I mentioned, and let me remind you, by the way, that in the email that was sent out, you have the list of all the names of these novels and the translations. So if you get interested in one, you have the references there for ordering them or getting them in the library. And I hope that will happen in a few cases. So the French literary scene is still very much alive. The French novel really came into its own in the 19th century, although for a good part of the 19th century, poetry and theater was still admired above the novel form. That was even true at the time of Victor Hugo, whom we think of as the great novelist, but he really was most revered as a poet. And anyway, the novel scene that we have known through the 19th and 20th century, many of you have read a lot of these novels, I know, has continued into the 20th century. I did a little check the other day. Every year in France, there's about 600 new novels published. And there are other novels in French published in places like Belgium and elsewhere, but just in France, you have about 600 novels in French published each year, along with a couple of hundred novels in translation. So over the period I'm covering, which is just novels in the last 20 years, there have probably been about 10,000 novels published in France. So I'm only dealing with 6 of them, a very tiny selection, but I hope it gives a little bit of representation. Literature writers are so much more revered in France than here. It's a very different kind of culture, although it's diminished. I remember reading Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer when he first went to France as a sort of expatriate in the 1930s. And he didn't have anything to write on his passport as his occupation, except the word écrivain he wrote on his entry sheet, which means writer in French. And he was astounded that the customs official practically bowed and showed such reverence for a writer arriving, which he didn't think would happen in the United States. And of course, he was right. So anyway, literary culture is very important in France. So is the prize system. most of the novels I'm going to be referring to have received some kind of prize in France, which does count for a lot in terms of sales. And even though some of those prizes are a little on the corrupt side, they still mean a lot, and people pay a great deal of attention to them. Okay, let me hope I advance this properly. We're going to start with this novel. These are in no particular order, by the way, just the order in which the slides got organized. I mentioned in the email that many of you got that several of the novels we'll be dealing with are not written by people who were originally or even now are French. Even in some cases like this one, writers whose native language is not French. That is the case with this novel. It has a double interest in terms of its relationship between a foreign language and French, as we'll see. Daoud is actually Algerian, and he was born there, still lives there despite real problems. And he grew up in a large family speaking Arabic in a Muslim family, fairly devout Muslim family. He studied French at a university, got married, divorced his wife because she got too religious, and then became a prominent journalist, which he still is, and a novelist. So he's a native Arab speaker who writes brilliantly and perfectly in a second language, the French language. This book, I think, is especially interesting because I think if there's any novel that many of you will have read in French, it's probably Camus' The Stranger. And that used to be on a lot of high school reading lists. I don't know if anybody read it, you could tell me. But I think it's a widely read book. This is a counter book. This is the answer to that book where Daoud creates a character who is not, as I mistakenly said in my email to you, the son of the person that Camus' character kills, the Arab that he kills, but rather the brother, the younger brother. So it's written as a man in his 70s recalling the murder of his brother. This, of course, the murder was a fictional murder in Camus' novel, but so vivid that he's writing a response to it, where the victim, his older brother, is given a name, is given a life, and is given some respect as a person, which Camus does not do. Camus, of course, won Nobel Prize for Literature, was an incredibly brilliant writer, but he had a very racial blind spot, you could say. He grew up in Algeria. He said he was really French only by virtue of the language. But in his novels like The Stranger and The Plague, the Arab people of Algeria are pretty much absent. And in his famous novel, The Stranger, to which this is a reply, this novel, the Arab victim of the murder, it never even gets a name. He's just called the Arab. So the narrator gives himself the name Haroun, and the opening sentence of this book is a very interesting one. If you remember The Stranger, it has a very, Camus' The Stranger, published during World War II. Camus' The Stranger has a very famous opening sentence, which is simply, "Mom died today. Maman est morte aujourd'hui." And this novel's opening sentence is, "Mom is still living." And so he's writing as a 75-year-old man whose mother is in her late 90s, kind of hates her, but he kind of has to look after her. And so he sets up a contrast with the novel to which he's responding. So basically, he creates a world where the Camus novel is a reality. His brother was murdered by Meursault, who is, as you see the title of the book, Meursault is Camus' character who kills sort of randomly an Arab on the hot beach in Algiers, and is subsequently tried and condemned, mainly not because he killed an Arab, but because he didn't cry at his mother's funeral, and sentenced to death. So that's the Camus novel, but it kind of ignores his victim. And so this creates a world where the victim's brother tells his story about how the mother spent her life as a kind of professional widow, but trying to get vengeance for her son's murder and trying to get recognition that he was a human being, even though, as we know, a fictitious one. So in the end, what happens is that the character of Harun, who is the protagonist telling the story, himself kills a Frenchman just a day or two after the end of the War of Independence. You know, there was a terrible, bloody War of Independence fought between 1954 and 62 in Algeria. Finally, the French left, and maybe 1 million or more were killed, almost all of them Algerians in the course of that. And but just after the peace agreement is signed by General de Gaulle and the Algerians, this character, the younger brother of Meursault's victim, the narrator of the book, this character kills a Frenchman. He's arrested for it, but the magistrate and the interrogators say, you know, killing the French during the war was all okay, but you made the mistake of killing this guy the day after the peace settlement. So it was a murder, whereas a day earlier it wouldn't have been. You would have done the same thing to the same person. But they release him anyway because they recognized that his brother, who had been killed so many years earlier in the Camus novel, was a martyr to French colonialism. So he escapes, but he never escapes the guilt of having killed this man. And so at the end of the novel, he kind of ruminates on all that has happened in his life, a completely defeated life, defeated by the death of his older brother, by his mother's obsession with it, by his own unhappiness. And he finally says at the end that he agrees with the last sentence in Camus' book, The Stranger, where the Meursault says to himself in his prison cell, I know they're going to decapitate me for this murder. And I hope there's a big crowd out there savagely cheering for my death. This is Camus' novel, but Daoud says the same thing at the end of his novel. His protagonist and narrator comes to the same conclusion, that he wants to die and wants the mob to cheer his death. So it's not a cheerful novel, but it's written with tremendous power and has the evocation of the reality of the colonized people, asserting, in this case, that they too are human, but in the language of, as you might say, of the conqueror. I'll show you here a picture of Daoud. This is the author. He has become very controversial, especially for his comments on religion. Algeria is not an Islamist republic like Iran, but even though they knocked out the power of the Islamist party in a horrible civil war in the 1990s, the fundamentalist Islam is having some comeback in Algeria. And you can imagine how they react to comments like this about religion. I'm going to quote from the book. These are all my own translations, so I don't say they're professional. He says, religion for me is public transportation that I just don't use. I hate religion and submission. Submission is, of course, the title of another book we're going to look at. It is what the word Islam means, submission. So he's really attacking Islam directly there. He says he hates the Friday mosque services, where the whole cosmos, he says, is reduced to washing your balls and reciting verses. As to the Quran, reading it, he says, is like listening to an old night watchman talking to himself. As an old man in Iran, he hates all the new mosques and minarets that are rising up, the kind of recrudescence of Islam in Algeria after the secularists supposedly won. And he fantasizes climbing up to the top of one of them, shouting sacrileges, curses, blasphemy. So here he is, an old dying man. The imam visits him and asks him to turn to God before he dies. And he says, I have so little time left, I don't want to waste it with God. Well, a fatwa was issued against him for this blasphemy. He sued, won in court, but I would say the things he has said about sexual repression in the Arab world and religion put him in danger of his life, though he does continue to live and work as a journalist in Algeria. So at this point, any comments or questions anybody wants to raise about that, I'll try to respond. you can unmute and just intervene. Otherwise, we can go on to the next one. Okay, by coincidence, this is the one that comes up. Probably of all the novels listed today, this would be the most controversial. And this is written by the so-called bad boy, of French literature. What can I say about Monsieur Welbeck? Let me show you his picture. He is an outrageous person. His books are extremely controversial. He's probably the most widely read and serious novelist in France today. Written a whole series of controversial novels. His personal life has been a series of unhappy marriages and divorces. You see him here with his current Chinese wife, who is 34 years younger than he is. He wrote the book Submission that I'm dealing with here in 2014. It was published exactly the same day as the terrorist attack on Charlie Hebdo, the French satirical weekly. And that terrorist attack occurred because some of the Islamist terrorists objected to a caricature of Muhammad that Charlie Hebdo had published, although they published caricatures of many other religious figures, Jews, Christians, and others, but that they dared to mock Muhammad gave rise to a terrorist attack that killed 12 people, including a friend of Welbeck's. But his book happened to be published the very same day that that happened. Now, the content of his book is indicated by the title. The title is just Soumission or Submission. Submission, as I said, is a translation of the word Islam. So you know this book has got an Islamic theme. And I think it was either the prime minister or the president of France said, after that attack on Charlie Hebdo, the satirical weekly, with all the loss of life and the trauma that caused in France, he said, Monsieur Welbeck, our author here, is not France, because he didn't want accepting the notion that this is an anti-Islamic novel, and that Welbeck is an Islamophobe, even if he is a successful novelist. Now, is he really or not? Let's get into that a little bit. So what happens in this novel is it's an imaginary novel set in the year 2022. Now, remember, it was published in 2014, set in 2022. We're coming up to that year ourselves now, so close to it. But he imagines an election situation, a presidential election situation in France, where an alliance of a rising Islamic party with the Socialist Party is created to make sure that the National Front, Le Pen, you probably heard of Le Pen and his daughter, the leaders of the National Front, right-wing anti-immigrant party in France, to make sure that she doesn't win. The result is, in his imagination in this book, that the Islamic Brotherhood party does get power. Their candidate becomes the president of France. So France gets an Islamic president. And things don't go well. In the lead up to this, there's a lot of violence going on, and the media are not covering it. The narrator, Francois, who is a professor at the Sorbonne, decides to get out of Paris and goes down to the south of France, where he is aware that violence is going on, that a huge transformation of power is occurring in France, and that basically sort of Islamization is occurring. This is all fantasy, of course, but supposedly happening in 2022. And because he's a university professor, he's in touch with the intellectual elites in France. And this novel can be seen, I think, as more of an attack on the corruption and cowardice of the French intellectual elite than on Islam. He shows, as the women are dismissed from the University of Paris faculty, and as the faculty are encouraged to convert to Islam, that most of them go along. And he himself, the narrator, goes back to Paris, and after his little sojourn taking refuge in the South, goes back to Paris and himself converts to Islam, but in exchange for a terrific apartment. So and he's also allowed to edit the Pléiade, the most prestigious edition of the relatively obscure writer on whom he built his academic reputation, Islam. So anyway, he shows the corruption, the supine bowing to power, whoever is in power, of the French intellectual elite, as they sort of did in 1940 when the Germans took over. Is this being kind of the central attack of this novel. It's a very comic, satirical novel. It's full of very funny passages. It's very macho. He's a very macho writer. He has a very male view of the world. He's known for his outrageous sexual scenes and his obsession with oral sex. And always only with the male's pleasure in mind. So those passages have not aroused as much criticism as the supposed Islamophobia. You can make what you will of Monsieur Welbeck. He has a new novel called Serotonin, which in the sexual department is even more outrageous than the preceding novels. That novel, Serotonin, was just published in 2019, about a jaded figure. Is it really he or not? We don't know how much of these characters is Welbeck himself, or whether he's mocking some of his own characters' views. But in Serotonin, he's a depressive, suicidal guy who gets by on psychotropic drugs. And in all of his novels seems to regret kind of the disappearance of a more traditional Catholic France, even though he is himself an atheist. Sorry about that ringing. It'll just ring twice and stop. I don't know how to stop it. Okay, let me pause for a minute there. If you have any comments you'd like to make about that, or any questions about it, about the Welbeck novel.
I have a general question.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Are these books also published in English? And if they are
all published in English, and I gave the names of the translations and the references in the email that was sent out, the notice about this meeting. Mike has sent it out 2 or 3 times. It can be sent again. There's a list of all the novels with the translations and the publishers and so on.
And would you say that, I mean, how much do they lose in translation is what I'm trying to ask.
Well, you know, any novel any work of literature may suffer in translation. Most of us know the great Russian writers in English, don't we? And some of those translations by Constance Garnett and others have been much criticized. We know Chinese literature in translation. I don't think there's anything wrong with reading translated literature. I think you get most of it. There are some things you don't get. For example, since you raised that, John, I'll just mention this very briefly. There are 2 forms of the past tense in French that are commonly recognized. One is called the passé composé, one the passé simple. This is the equivalent of saying, I have done something, or I did something. Now, in most French literature today, the older form, the shorter form, the I did, has disappeared. But in Welbeck, he uses the more, I won't quite say archaic, but the more widely used earlier form of the past tense. Now, a French reader in French immediately recognizes that by choosing that form of the past tense, he's asserting a kind of attachment to the older tradition of literature. I might say that, interestingly, Daoud, whom I mentioned before, the Algerian writer, also uses the earlier form of the past tense, even though, very strikingly, Camus, writing in 1942, didn't use that form. He already used the more modern conversational past tense. So for a French reader, I think reading Daoud would notice that he has chosen to use the older form of the past tense as a kind of response to Camus. Like, I'm going to be even more of an eminent French writer than you, because I'm using this more traditional past tense, which, by the way, Camus does use in his other novels.
That's very interesting.
So, I mean, there are other nuances like that. I can say I have had a lot of trouble, and I'm not, because, after all, we have an audience of very proper people here. I'm not giving you a lot of the sexual quotations from these books, but Welbeck uses a huge amount of sexual obscene slang. And I haven't seen these English translations, but it must be a tremendous challenge to translate some of this. Dare I give you one example? La pipe. He is obsessed with la pipe. This is fellatio, or the common English translation is blowjob. This is his fixation. It appears in all of his novels. And so la pipe, you know what a pipe is, of course. So that's the French word for that English popular term. Now, whether it's an exact equivalence in translation, who can say? You almost have to be in that culture to know the exact resonance that has when he refers to la pipe. But I think I understand that some of the translators of some of these books, we're going to get to the one about the Guvin, have done an excellent job of translating slang, but it's a huge challenge.
Bob?
Yeah.
This book, Submission, reminds me a little bit of Philip Roth's
Yes,
The Plot Against America.
that's right. And also the Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here. Yeah, I had a note to mention those. I'm
So
glad you brought them up.
Would you put it in that same category?
It's wildly more satirical and funny, although Roth has his funny side, but this guy goes a great deal farther in the mockery part. Roth's book is pretty scary, actually.
Yes, it is.
What scares you about Submission, if you do decide to read it, if you haven't, it almost has a little suggestion of what's coming for us. Like this guy that gets elected president of France starts doing things that aren't expected. And he does it in a cleverer way than Trump would ever do. And he knows how to corrupt people and offer them the rewards that will get them to forfeit their principles and take the money and run, as we might say, especially the academic intellectuals. He loves stabbing them. Welbeck, by the way, has a degree in agronomy of all things, and went from that to a successful novelist career. I might mention that he has an unbelievably embittered relationship with his mother. And his first novel, which is called Les Particules Élémentaires, it's called Atomized, I think, in English. He spews out hatred for his mother, and which reflects the situation in real life. His parents sort of dumped him on his communist grandmother when he was a little boy. And the mother was so outraged by what was clearly a portrayal of her in this widely read novel, which launched his career in 1998, that she wrote a counter novel. And you may remember, Gloria, that Philip Roth's wife, Claire Bloom, did the same thing.
Yeah.
She objected to his novel, I Married a Communist. And so in this case, it was mom writing a novel denouncing her unbelievably successful author son because of the savage treatment he gave her in that novel. That's just a bit of literary gossip. But yeah, there is a parallel with the Roth. Anything else on Submission? Okay. This is a completely different kettle of tea, Delfin De Vigon. This is a kind of family novel, shall we say, but what a dysfunctional family. You see the stunningly beautiful woman on the cover. This is not Delfin De Vigon, the author of this novel. This is her mother. It's a photograph of her real mother. And part of what Vigon is doing in this novel is trying to understand why her mother committed suicide at age 61. Her physical beauty was part of her life experience that shaped her. But as we learn, the basic reason that her mother had these terrible ups and downs and suicidal problems and hospitalizations was that she was severely bipolar. And also came out of a family, which I will say that my professor, Ilevsky, who couldn't join us today, unfortunately, because he's teaching a class at Roosevelt, he says the family she describes emerging from in this novel is not that atypical, but I kind of think that it is, even in France, because we're talking about multiple suicides, incest, parents who walk around the house naked and so on. I don't think that's the typical French family, although it may be a bit more widespread than we realize. Anyway, this is in the genre of what they are calling autofiction. It's a very big phenomenon in France. I think it exists here too. Maybe, Elisa, you can tell us whether it's more common in England now, where you can hardly distinguish whether it's an autobiographical work or a novel. It's clearly directly taken out of her family experience. There were even happened to be a TV documentary about her family that many people had seen, but she also constructs it as a work of art and a novel. So what she says is that she regards this novel as a paper coffin for her mother, a search for the origin of her suffering. She says, unable to free myself fully from real life, that is just an outright autobiography, I produce an involuntary fiction. I seek the angle that will enable me to approach things ever more closely. I look for a space of neither truth nor invention, but both at the same time. So it's very much from her painful experience living with this mother who suffered so much and struggled so hard to have a fulfilled life. And some really horrible things happen in it. Her grandfather, who's the dominant figure in the family history, at one point tries to impose himself sexually on his own granddaughter. He, though a very imposing figure and somebody who dominated the family, descends into drunkenness and a horrible form of dementia. She says, Grandpa George had been a fascinating and destructive father, a wacky and seductive grandfather, but he became an embittered old man. Bitterness swallowed him. So this is sad stuff. The whole novel is extremely sad, but it's herself coming to terms with this. She has her own children now, and she has become a crusader for the treatment of bipolar disease in France, which she says is much more widespread than people realize. She winds up finding her mother dead, having been dead for 5 days in her bed. She missed an important note that would have alerted her to this. And she concludes, looking at her mother's diary and so on, that Lucille, the mother, loved nothing as much as drinking, smoking, and damaging herself. And she says her pain will never leave us. So if you want something kind of cheery, you might want to look at this novel. It's very beautifully written, and it's a family story. Some of us can relate to the mental illness side of it in our own families, and nobody could do it, I think, more beautifully. She's got a very wide audience in France. She's living with a guy who runs the most popular literary program on French television. To give you a little example of corruption in French literary circles, he presented her book on his program as a great breakthrough book without mentioning that he was living with her. So, so be it. Any questions about this one?
Real fast one. This Rien ne se pose à la nuit. I take it that's the title.
No, the time, la nuit means the night. It means nothing stops the night. Rien ne se pose à la nuit. The night is the night of her mother's soul, you might say, the darkness.
You have a picture of the author?
Yes, sorry. You see, she resembles Mom. And well, here's Mom. You see the cover of the book over
Yes.
to her right is the actual mother, and you see she resembles her mother. She's now in her 50s, this lady.
And what award did she get for this novel?
She won, I'm not sure, she won 2 or 3 awards. There are over 900 literary awards in France. It's hard to keep track of them. There's only 5 or 10 that are at the top. She won one of the big ones, maybe 2 of them. And she's won for other novels too. She's written quite a few novels. Like others, she also does other stuff, film and commentary. She's often interviewed on television. I can mention, if you want to go to YouTube search or Google, you can find interviews, because you have in that email the names of all these authors. You can find interviews with them. Mostly, if you look enough, you'll find that they give interviews in English too. Most of them can speak English. So you might want to connect to their personalities a bit by looking at some of those interviews. I couldn't get video very well onto the presentation today. Anything more about Ms. De Vigon? As I say, this is a new genre, very much read now in France, of these sort of autofiction, it's called.
Yes, we might want to connect to their personalities or not.
Yes, yes, indeed. I honestly think that she is a brilliant writer. Extremely painful reading, I have to say. Let's go to this book. I love this book. This Meyer Guvin, older brother is the English translation. You see, he won the Goncourt Prize for first novel. The big Goncourt that's the biggest literary prize in France, just the outright Goncourt Prize. But there's a separate one for the best first novel, and he won that one, plus a couple of other prizes. Guvin is a young writer. He's in his 30s. His mother, his parents were refugees who came to France. He was born there. His mother, Turkish, and his father, Iraqi Kurdish. They came to France as refugees. He was kind of a dreamer boy in American terms, in terms of citizenship. He was born in France, but he didn't get recognized citizenship until he was 13. And I don't know about his parents, although I think they're now deceased. Anyway, we'll have a look at him here. Here he is. Now, I'll tell you a cute anecdote. I think it's kind of charming. During the height of COVID, when everybody in France was in confinement and they had real lockdown there, much more than we did. We were reading in our Zoom French class with Professor Ilevsky this novel by Guvin. And I had the idea, why not send him an email, figuring when our class meets, it's maybe 9 o'clock in Paris, and he's going to be stuck in his house. What's he doing? He can't go out and do anything. Maybe he'd just tune into our Zoom class to discuss his own novel, which he then did. So our little class of 5 or 6 people had him, and I asked him in the email if he would give us 15 minutes. He gave us the whole time, an hour and a half.
Wait. This is an old technique of Bob Clarke's. 1967, he used to pull the same trick.
Well, all right.
Very powerful uses, yes.
Yeah, well, we used to use the more primitive technology at that time, the telephone group connections and so on for class. But yeah, but Guvin anyway, we won't go into the other telephone calls, Peter. Guvin is a really charming person, and he's written a real breakthrough novel. It has a lot of appeal because I use the term ghetto. It's not exactly right, but he evokes the world of what the kind of French equivalent of the ghetto. These are what they call la banlieue, the suburbs, especially to the north of Paris, where there's a concentration of North African, Black African, and Middle Eastern people, or French, born in France, but of that descent, who are leading an excluded life of a lot of police brutality. If you have Netflix, you might see a really good film called Les Miserables, just like the famous Hugo musical and book. But it's about these areas. It really evokes the life there very well. Anyway, he plunges into this world. And a unique thing about this book in terms of French literature these days is that he uses the language of the streets and of these people. This is a story of 2 brothers. Their father is an immigrant into France who's settled in and become somewhat assimilated. He gets a doctorate, but he winds up working as a taxi driver because of basically racial discrimination. And so the mother has died. She was a French woman. And the 2 boys, the 2 brothers, live with dad in this very tough world. The younger brother betrays dad. I'm sorry, the older brother betrays dad, by becoming an Uber driver. And of course, Dad has had this rough life in France, but his whole hope is to retire. And his nest egg is his taxi medallion. You know, those have great value, but, or did have until the ride services were created. So his son is participating in the very profession that's destroying the value of his father's nest egg. The other son, who writes alternate chapters of the book, gets wrapped up in the rising Islamist movements in France and actually goes to Syria as a, not as a terrorist, but he goes as a kind of medic. He's become a nurse in France, but he goes to Syria out of a kind of Islamic idealism and gets drawn into some very terrible circles there in the vicious civil war against Assad, and comes back to Paris under some duress, very risky situation where he barely gets out of Syria, reconnects with his brother, and seems to be engaged in a terrorist mission, because the way he got free of the people that had entrapped him in Syria is if he agrees to participate in a terrorist attack in Paris. Now, I'm not going to tell you what happens, because I hope some of you will read the translation of this book. It's called Older Brother in English, and apparently the translation is excellent. But there's a very big surprise ending. The language of this book is so refreshing and different, so difficult to translate, I'm sure. It's difficult for the French reader to the extent that Vigon includes a glossary at the end of the book of all the street slang terms, many of which are Arabic and African and so on, that are worked into the lives of the people that he depicts. So he has touched on the lives of people that don't usually get noticed in French novels. There's a few others doing this, but very few. And this novel deservedly got a lot of success and recognition. I hope he produces more. It has a very fresh feeling to it. You'll relate to some of these drives where he's taking these rich people in his Uber to the airport, and the class differences that get evoked there, and all the talk about the mosques in Paris. And I just want to quote one little passage, and we'll move on from him. He's talking about a particular subset of Islamic fundamentalist fanatics in France, but they're not Arabs, they're not African, they're not Muslim really. They're white French young guys who were kind of outsiders and solve their personal problems by converting to Islam and becoming fanatical Muslims and even terrorists. And he describes a situation where the two brothers are at this radical mosque in Paris. And he says, I was focusing on Kamel, a guy he sees as Kamel. I was sure he was a Babtu. Babtu means a Muslim who's really a white Frenchman. It wasn't just his red beard and his schnoz. Now, I say schnoz because he's using a very complicated slang term for nose. It wasn't just his red beard and schnoz, because the Berbers and Kabyles, these are from Algeria, can be redheads. But his way of speaking and pushing every argument to extremes, maybe he was from Brittany or a guy from the north. In short, the so-called heaviest dude. He spoke like a loony, crazy with no pauses. In our neighborhood, the so-called slums or ghettos, we call them whites with complexes. All their buddies are North Africans. He uses a slang word there, or Muslim blacks, that's another slang term. And they, the white guys who have converted out of admiration, fascination, or just a wish to belong to something, wind up by converting. Well, you can become a Muslim, but you can't become a North African. I'm sorry, you can become a Muslim, but you can't become a North African. That's impossible. You can't change your genes. Then they play the leaders and lecture everybody on what religion must or must not be. In the media, there's no little talk of them, but they're a minority at the root of the majority of our problems. Now, they're a category that's never mentioned in any other French novels that I've seen. White guys that have become Muslim fanatics and taken Muslim names, but are really just, fucked up white guys. Any questions about that novel? Okay. Maybe this is my favorite of all of them, Mabankou. Vercassé is the French translation would be broken glass. Here, Mabankou is on the left. You see him here pictured with James Baldwin. He's done a book about James Baldwin, who's a kind of idol of his. Mabankou on the left is in his 50s now. He's from Republic of the Congo. This is not the big Congo that most people know, the used to be called Zaire, the huge Central African country. This is the one just across the river, the former French colony, sometimes called Congo-Brazzaville. Its capital is Brazzaville, not the Kinshasa Congo. So he's from that smaller former French colony, not the former Belgian colony, from a town called Pointe Noire, which is a city of about 1 million on the sea, not the capital city of Brazzaville. So he's another person who grew up not speaking French, but has become an absolute master of the French language. He's published many novels. Mabankou is now a professor at UCLA. You can find some interviews with him in English. He wrote, in my opinion, in this novel, something really creative and brilliant. I have to say that the other members of the class reading this didn't like this novel. Professor Ilevsky found it flawed and pretentious. I found it fantastic. It's a comic, satiric novel. Nobody is spared. He uses a very interesting literary device. If you remember in the 1001 Nights, Scheherazade, it's a literary device where all the stories get told because she has to come up with a new story every night or be executed. Or in the Canterbury Tales of the Decameron of Boccaccio, the literary device is people on pilgrimage gather in the inn each night and share stories. Well, he has a different literary device. His narrator and protagonist, who is a broken vessel, really, is a former school teacher who's lost his job through horrible circumstances in the African city of Pointe Noire, and hangs around a sort of seedy bar there, which is known as Credit Took a Trip. And the owner is friendly to him, lets him drink his cheap wine there, but he keeps a little notebook. And people know that he's writing their life stories in there as they spill them out to him sitting down drinking. So the literary device is he's getting all these tales of other people in this African city and uses that to expound his view of what's happening in Africa and in French and Africans going to France. What he does is really very creative and very funny. About 7 or 8 major stories are told. He skewers the corrupt African elites. He's unsparing in his denunciation of pretentious African intellectuals in France and back in Congo-Brazzaville. He's unsparing in his attack on the phony kind of communism that was created in that country at one point. He incidentally went to a high school in Pointe Noire. It's called Karl Marx High School. And he also, of course, skewers the French colonizers and their racism and so on. I thought I'd mention just one of the stories that he recounted, or no, two of the characters that come into the bar and tell the narrator their tales of woe and what happened to their broken lives like his own. One is about the guy who wears Pampers. This is an adult man who walks around the streets of Pointe Noire visibly wearing diapers. This is an ugly story, and it tells you something about how Mabankou is unsparing in his treatment of his own country. This man is wearing diapers because he had a terrible fight with his wife where she assembled the neighborhood against him and made violent accusations against him for hanging around with prostitutes, which was true. Anyway, the neighborhood turns on him, the police beat him up, drag him off, and he winds up in jail. He's raped so frequently in jail over a period of 2.5 years that he has bodily damage that forces him for the rest of his life to wear diapers. So it's a really, it has its humorous side, but it has this ugly depiction of police violence, cruelty, and horrible abuse in prison, and a broken man who nevertheless tells his tale to the narrator. Another one is called The Printer, another tale. This is a man who's very proud that he did France. He left the African country of Congo, tells the narrator about his life. He said, I really belong in France, but it didn't work out there. He went to France, made a big success. He got to be supervisor in a big printing company, married a French woman. He dropped his African wife and son, big mistake, and then married this French woman. Then things start to fall apart, as do the lives of all of the people that come into this novel. So he's made a success in France. He's married this French woman. He's living in a suburb, away, as he says, from the other Blacks in France. They're having their happy, successful life. Then he finds a condom in the toilet. And the condom is so huge that he realizes his wife is doing something with somebody who is very much more endowed even than he is. And then he discovers in flagrante delicto his wife in a sadomasochistic scene with his own son from his previous marriage. And they attack and beat him with the whip that they're using in their sexual encounter. And he winds up being arrested. He loses custody of the twin daughters and has to go back to hang around this seedy bar in Pointe Noire and tell his story to the narrator. But he does boast of the fact, I made it big in France, it just didn't work out. And I'll quote you just one little passage there, if you don't mind. He says, I was somebody in France, head of a big team at a printing plant. He says, not just any, now I'm using the word Negro here because he uses the word nègre in French. I'm using, not just any Negro can hire and fire whites. They who colonized, Christianized, jammed us into the holds of ships, whipped, trampled them, those whites who burned their gods, those whites who destroyed their rebels, razed their empires to the ground. I hired whites, I hired Orientals, I hired all kinds. I threw them in with the other wretched of the earth, Negroes just like me. I had a good job. Well, you see so much is being evoked there about racial class relations in France, the inability for this to work when he seeks to make a life there, the return to Africa, the complete failure to be able to create a decent life there. Mabankou has been much criticized for not painting a rosier picture of life in Africa, but he certainly is unsparing in his attacks on French behavior. And when the president of France, the current president Macron, rather recently invited Mabankou, because he's a very prestigious and well-known writer now, invited him to join what they call the Francophonie movement, which is the movement of all French writing in French, wherever it comes from, Africa, Haiti, Belgium, wherever. He said no. He said, because this is an instrument of neocolonialism. You seem to be giving the impression you respect us who write in French from Africa, but it's really, we're second-class writers. Another writer, a Moroccan, Leila Slimani, you may have seen her book, Chanson Douce, I forget the title in French, in English. Anyway, very well-known novel about the nanny in Paris who kills the children that she's entrusted with. This woman accepted, she's a Moroccan writer who writes in French. She accepted to join Macron's operation, excuse me, but Mabankou said no. So any questions about him or this novel? I think we're about at the end of our time. So any comments about any of this would be more than welcome.
Well, I'd like to thank you for doing all this. I've never heard of any of these people before.
Well, if any of these pique your interest, I urge you to read them. Now, I have not actually looked at the translations, but some of them have been highly praised. Oh, I left out, I'm sorry, I left out a crucial novel here. This one, oh my God, how could I do that? You mind if I backtrack a minute? This is an important novel, I must mention it. This was the sixth one, how could I have left it out? This is a blockbuster. I have a copy of it here. I don't know if you can see it, I'm holding it up. It's what they call a pavé in French. It means it's like a heavy stone. And it's about 900 pages in the French edition. It's almost 1,000 pages in the English translation. It's written by an American. And his father is a very well-known author, Robert Littell, of spy novels. They're both American. Jonathan, the author of this book, was spent his earlier years in France. He's completely bilingual, and graduated from Yale. He worked for an NGO, a humanitarian organization, for several years. Then he suddenly produced, after years of research, this incredible book, which is called in English, The Kindly Ones. Now, in my email to you, I misspelled it. I could have corrected that misspelling, but I deliberately didn't, because I want you to notice in the French title, it ends in ES, right? I left the E out. That's crucial in French because les bienveillantes tells you that these are females. So the kindly ones are female kindly ones. And who are they? This is the French translation, or the kindly ones would be the English translation, from the Greek, the Eumenides. This is the play of Aeschylus, the Oresteia trilogy, where these kindly ones intervene to spare Orestes from being punished for killing his mother. You remember in the Greek myth, he and his sister kill Clytemnestra, their mother, because she has and her lover have killed their father Agamemnon. Anyway, this whole book kind of is inspired by that Greek myth. And so the bienveillantes, the kindly ones, are the Eumenides from the Greek tragedy. But what's so striking about this book is that he has created, and it is narrated entirely, all 900 pages in the French edition, by an SS officer who is depicted by the author, an American writing in French. He won the Goncourt, the top literary prize in French for this novel in France, depicted as living almost like Forrest Gump through all of the horrors of the Nazi exterminations, especially the Einsatzgruppen and exterminations in Ukraine. But he goes through the whole Nazi era. He meets everybody, Himmler, he meets finally even Hitler at the end, and tweaks Hitler's nose. And so who is this protagonist? There's a lot of reaction against this book because usually people think the leading character, the protagonist of a book, has to be the hero. Well, he's not a hero in any sense. He is a committed Nazi, but he's an intellectual Nazi, a highly cultivated man who rises to high officer position in the SS and participates in many, many horrifying atrocities. But in the course of this, you get also a whole parallel story of bizarre sexual history, where the narrator is basically still in love with his twin sister, whom he has slept with and has now died. But he's so obsessed with the sexual memory of her that he, in the course of all his Nazi peregrinations, nevertheless, in his sexual life, must be penetrated by men so that he can experience what his dead twin sister, whom he used to have sex with, would herself have experienced as a woman. Well, go figure. Anyway, like the Greek myth, he, the protagonist, hates his parents, especially his mother. And I'm going to allow myself to tell you what's actually in this, even though it may be a little disturbing to some. He kills both of his parents. He's an SS officer. He gets by with this. This is still during the war. He gets to the south of France. His parents are there. There's some food shortages. They're surprised to see him because they're so alienated from him. He goes into the house and says, your son's back, and there are food shortages. He's brought them a huge sausage for dinner, but he doesn't tell them that he has just been using this sausage as a dildo on himself. And that's served up for dinner. They have that. Then he hacks them to death. And so there's this grotesque story of the smartly done up Nazi officer carrying out these atrocities against Jews, and especially Jews. and never really repenting, but being a highly cultivated man and ultimately escaping. At the end of the war, he gets free of the bunker where he's pinched Hitler's nose and gets out through the subway system in Berlin at the very end of the war, winds up as a lace merchant in France, and sort of ruminates on his grotesque history. Let me just read you the epiphany he has at one point toward the end of the book. He remembers the little Jewish girl that he and his fellow SS people publicly hanged in Kharkov. He says, we hanged her as a butcher would cut a steer's throat without any emotion because it had to be done. They were the rules of the game, our game, that is the Nazi game. But the girl wasn't a pig or a cow. She was a girl, like my sister. There's no name for such cruelty. Then he says, crucially, no matter that it was objectively necessary. Still, it spoiled everything. If you can do that, then you can do anything. Nothing's assured, made no sense. I no longer understood anything, and I wanted to be alone and no longer understanding anything. Where does that lead us? He's not repentant. He says these horrible racist slaughters were objectively necessary. And he then goes on to suggest that the racism of the Nazis was such that if they had been allowed to fulfill their plan, they would have wound up slaughtering a lot more Slavs than Jews. They just didn't get the chance because the Slavs were also undermentioned. One little grotesque scene, I'll mention one more and then not talk about this anymore. But at the like Forrest Gump, he's everywhere during the war that matters, including the aftermath of the Battle of Stalingrad. And he finds out about an episode of cannibalism involving the German soldiers who have become so desperate in this Soviet-Russian winter and so on, you know, the horrors of the Battle of Stalingrad, that they have to resort to cannibalism. They've got a bunch of Soviet prisoners who they've been starving and mistreating, so they could eat them. But they have a discussion and they decide that because the Slavs are inferior Untermenschen, it's not a good idea to eat them because that might sort of get into your system. But if you have to eat, Teutonic Germans, that's a problem because you'd have to eat the regular soldiers in your own army. So they decide to eat the German volunteers who are in these separate sort of inferior units fighting alongside the regular army. And they make a meal of several of them. But what is this kind of driving at? This extreme notion of biological racism, even at one point where the author meditates, maybe we shouldn't have killed those hill Jews from the Caucasus because although they're called Jews, they're not racially Jewish. And the point was to get them for racial reasons, not for religious reasons. So the twisted Nazi thinking all comes through in this, but he isn't really punished. He survives. He's the anti-hero to end all anti-heroes. Make what you will of this. It's an absolutely fascinating book. I'm leaving out, of course, all the details because of the immense size of the book. Okay, so much on that. That does cover all of them then. Here's Littell, the young author. He wrote this when he was 38 years old. So any other questions or comments? That does conclude the presentation.
Bob, I
Hey,
want to
Bob.
thank you. Go on.
Bob, can I just ask you a quick question?
Of course.
You mentioned that literature seems to be more highly regarded in France than the US. Maybe I'm not phrasing that right, but
It is.
would you say that it's true with poetry too? Do you know?
Oh yeah. As a matter of fact, even Welbeck, the man that you saw with the young Chinese wife there, and writes these outrageous novels with all the sexual craziness. He is also a published poet. And going back, as I said, to Victor Hugo, in the classical French tradition of literature, going back to the 17th century, poetry and theater outranked everything. And the novel was very secondary. So even a lot of French novelists feel they have some duty to be poets also. Poetry is definitely very widely read and admired in France, not as much as it used to be. But what I wanted to stress in that is that in the more mass culture, there's a kind of deference to literature and writers that we don't have here. The most admired people in France historically have not been kings or generals, but writers. And I think that is still to a significant degree true. There are television programs. There was one called Apostrophe. It ended in 1990, but this was on for many years. It was a literary, it was a really advanced version of Oprah's book club, but I mean, way beyond that, where interviews with important writers would be carried out in great detail. But this had an immense audience to the point where when this program was on, everybody in France was watching it. You know, everything shut down. The cafes, people would stop their conversations to watch this writer being interviewed. Now that's diminished a bit since that program ended in 1990, but there are successor programs with very wide audiences. And if you tune into them, you can see them on YouTube. Sometimes there are subtitles. You will hear very serious literary discussions with wide audiences. People talk a lot about literary prizes in France and who gets them and whether they deserve them. And I just think the writing culture is more deeply implanted and admired there than it is here. Well, there's no question that that's true.
Bob, wasn't there a recent scandal having to do with a prominent writer who was on some of these committees that,
Yes,
these prize committees, having to do with pedophilia?
yes,
And
he was a horrendous pedophile abuser, and he was on the jury and awarding prizes to himself and others. This got taken up by the French version of the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement in France is called Balance ton cochon. That means stick it to your pig. And so the French feminist Me Too movement has turned on these people. Welbeck is an example, by the way. He's not a pedophile, but he's certainly a misogynist, and yet a tremendously admired novelist. And I have to say, a brilliant writer, but at the same time, a misogynist. But the case you're citing is a pretty extreme one, where this was all covered up. This was the kind of corruption Welbeck attacks in Submission, where the literary and intellectual elite cover each other's tracks. Happened with Strauss-Kahn also, as you may recall. He was on the way to becoming president of France until that Haitian maid, and was she Haitian in New York, reported his aggression.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
I
you're
think-
absolutely right. There was
I
such a
think
scandal.
his own stepdaughter wrote an expose of him, and only after that was some action taken to, you know, to publicly shame him.
Interestingly, it deep sixed his prospects for the French presidency, whereas Trump got to be president even after that outrageous tape about grabbing women by the cunt was widely circulated. Didn't stop him, but it did stop Strauss-Kahn. Yeah, so yes, the prizes matter. The literary prizes are so sought after. It's partly financial, because if you get one of the big prizes, there are going to be big sales. So some of the publishing houses have corrupt relationships with the prize juries and sort of push their own books and so on. Nevertheless, the 6 books I've presented to you here, I think all have tremendous merit. Any one of them would be worth reading. Maybe you get some sense from what I said about whether one or another might turn you on, but they got prizes, and I would say they deserved them.
Anyone else have a comment to make?
Yes.
I just wonder, why is the title of this The Kindly Ones? Is this an ironic title?
No, yeah, as I tried to explain, it is the translation from the Greek play of Aeschylus called the Eumenides. The Eumenides are the kind of the governors of fate, and they intervene in the play by Aeschylus. It's called the Kindly Ones, is the name of the play. And this novel does take its structure and plot partly from that play. So The Kindly Ones is a translation of the Eumenides. And it has an ironic tone, of course, but it's kind of, you might say, the narrator, who is a monster, basically, is kind of seeking, as Orestes got, to get by with it through the intervention of the Kindly Ones, who allow the arguments in Orestes' trial to free him. Incidentally, one of the arguments made in that trial, I think Athena intervenes in the trial, but one of the arguments is, in ancient Greece, it's a far bigger crime to kill your father than your mother. And the reason is that the child is biologically and exclusively the product of the father. The mother's just kind of an oven where the child is baked. But so you kill her, you haven't really done that much damage, because of course Orestes kills his mother. And but killing the father would have been a greater crime, and that kind of helps him. The Kindly Ones let him get off for killing mom. So that's where the title comes from. It's a direct translation of the title of the third play in the Oresteia trilogy of Aeschylus.
Any other comments?
Whoa,
You had a comment, Gloria?
no, just,
Okay.
I'm very grateful and got a lot to think about.
I agree.
So Bob, we want to thank you for a really sophisticated and nuanced and then not so nuanced presentation.
Well, it's
Not
just
in
my
French.
hobby. You know, I don't present myself as an authority in French literature. It's just something I've dug into and really, really admire.
And you've introduced a lot of us to a whole new world of literature that we had no idea existed, most of us.
Well, good. I'm glad.
So that was a fascinating talk, and I'm going to be bugging you about further talks into the future because you're one of the greatest presenters we've ever had here.
Oh,
I mean,
please.
Here, here,
just-
here, here.
That's fantastic.
Merci.
Yes,
So our
on
next
behalf of
presentation,
thousands and thousands of other students of Bob Clarke's over so many years, I can't tell you the world that he opened up for so many of us.
Oh my God, Peter, I can't believe you're saying
The
that.
depth, the travel, the language, the books, and a few other things, as you might imagine, but it was quite a
Setting
quite an
those aside.
experience.
so our next talk, I will be presenting on the only two pre-Clovis sites in all of the ancient Americas that have actual human DNA evidence of being pre-Clovis, and that's at Monteverde in Chile and Paisley Cave in Oregon. So I will be discussing with you what we mean by all of that. How did they deduce at these two sites that there was actual human DNA evidence, and how does research like this come to be accepted? And along the way in my talk, I will be discussing two other sites that do not have human DNA evidence, but are so close to having absolute proof that they're worth considering as proven pre-Clovis sites. So that will be the discussion of my talk, illustrated talk, in our next presentation at the end of October.
That'll be great. We are so lucky to have Mike Ruggieri. I think he deserves a hand.
Yes.
It's fun. It's fun. Jim?
I said bravo.
Oh,
okay.
thank you, Jim.
You're going to have something to say. All right, so we're going to sign off now. Bob, I have recorded this for everyone, so it'll go out to the world tomorrow. And
Okay.
thanks a lot for the presentation. And I know that I'm going to prevail on you to give us further talks in the future. I mean,
Well, I have a stack of books I haven't mentioned yet. There's a lot more that I left out there. Some of them damned interesting.
whatever you want to talk about, you're welcome.
All right.
I've unmuted myself and I want to just quickly say, I have friends in France who started out as exchange students with my daughter when she was in high school. And this is going to open up a whole new avenue of conversation, which I really appreciate.
Oh, good. I hadn't thought of that angle.
Yeah, well, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Il n'y a pas de quoi.
Merci.
So, all right, I'm
Au
gonna
revoir à tous.
say goodbye to everybody and end the meeting and hope to see you again at the end of October. Thanks for
Thank
participating
you, thank you, thank you.
and thanks a million, Bob.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.